right, tonight we're going to talk about a very challenging subject, one for which answers are hard to come by, but nonetheless one we should be familiar with, be aware of the data, and be able to handle it intelligently and maturely. So we're going to talk about the origin of man and what we can learn about this from science. Before we begin, let's pause to ask God's blessing. Lord, tonight we especially invite you to be here as we seek to consider what we can know about the origin of man from science. You have told us where we come from. We don't doubt that. But we are trying to make sense out of the data that we have from the earth. Bless us, bless our understanding as we seek truth. In Jesus' name, amen. We have looked at issues which seem to favor the evolutionary model from a scientific perspective. And we talked about radiometric dating and other dating methods. We talked about the fossil record. And one of the issues in the fossil record is the hominid record. That's the record of fossil men. And there are other things that we could consider on this list as well. We also talked about data that presently appear to favor a biblical model. We talked about the origin of life and how data on the origin of life are adamantly resistant to attempts to use them to explain how life could have originated without a creator. And to any unbiased perspective, the origin of life has to be a challenge to any evolutionist who is paying attention to the data. The fossil record, the sudden appearances of complex life form, fully formed, and present in the early Cambrian, every major phylum of animals, with the exception of the bryozoa, which show up a little later. But if we just generalize the sudden appearance of every major phylum in the lower Cambrian, that's astonishing in the challenge it presents to the evolutionary model. We also talked about the general absence of intermediate forms, how when we look at the fossil record, we don't find intermediates. The few cases where a case can be made for intermediates, such as the evolution of whales and the evolution of horses and things like that, can easily be set aside by careful evaluation of the data. But more importantly still is the data that I presented to you earlier from the work of a biologist who recently retired from Oxnard College in California. Prothero is his name. And he spent his whole career studying the development of mammals in the tertiary. So he studied 160 lineages of mammals looking for the evolutionary changes that he expected to see. And the conclusion at the end of his career is that in those 160 lineages that he studied, there was no evidence for change from the time of their first appearance until they disappear from the fossil record. So their whole history is one of stasis, and that, of course, is incompatible with the theory of evolution. We also talked about sedimentology and catastrophism and how we have a general absence of evidence for time in the fossil record, so that even though we don't understand some of the aspects of radiometric dating, when we look at the data themselves, they seem to support the idea of short time. We also talked about molecular biology that tells us that all of the complexity of modern organisms on the earth today, including man, all of this complexity at the cellular level was already there in the first organism that shows up in the Cambrian. So there hasn't been anything in terms of complexity at the cellular level, there hasn't been anything added since the very first appearance of organisms in the Cambrian. And if we look for the origin of that complexity, where do we look? So we look at the beginning of the Cambrian, we see all the complexities there. Where would you look for the evolution of that complexity?
At the top?
No, in the Precambrian. You'd have to look below that, right? It'd have to be earlier than that if it's going to develop that complexity. And when you look for the evidence of complexity developing in the Precambrian, you don't find it. So that's where the situation is with respect to issues other than the origin of man. And tonight we're going to talk about the origin of man. We presented this illustration to show that you could consider the balances to be like this. They are not like this, they're not like that. At least in our current level of understanding, they are like this. And if they're like this, then that means that those who know the science, which is you know the science because you've been sitting in this class for the whole time we're here. For those who know the science, the decision about origins is always going to be based on something other than science. Because if you have this situation with respect to the data from science, how can you use the science to decide what you're going to believe about origins? You can't. It cancels out. So then you're going to have to look somewhere else. And where do people generally look? To their philosophies, to their religions, to something outside of science. So if you choose to believe a particular position on origins, be it an agnostic position, an atheistic position, or a theistic or creationist position, it's based not on the science, it's based on your own presuppositions and your own, what you bring to the problem. So that's very important to understand, and this is why when you try to talk to somebody about evolution, and it's also true if you try to talk to somebody about creation, you're not going to get anywhere with them because you're talking against their religion. You're talking against their philosophy, not against a specific piece of data. So that's why it's going to be very difficult to persuade people using data from science. Nonetheless, we need to be aware of the science and understand it. And in particular, the data based on the origin of man is a challenge to probably creationists as well as evolutionists, but we'll go through the data and look at it. This talk was put together by Dr. Lee Spencer, and I am greatly indebted to him for his understanding of these issues. So here we are. What are the data? What is it we are going to understand? We're going to look at the Hominoidea. That's the group of organisms that includes the apes, the great apes, and humans. And we'll talk a little about biostratigraphic relationships, but not much. The Hominoidea is the superfamily that contains the apes and man. When this was first proposed, it was very controversial because it put humans and apes in the same family, same superfamily. Within the Hominoidea are three families: the Hylobatidae, which is the gibbons, the brachiators; the Pongidae, the great apes, the knuckle-walking apes; and Hominidae, which is man. And right here in this picture, you can see the difference between these three groups. The brachiators have long arms, and they use these arms to swing on branches, and they rarely go on the ground. When they do go on the ground, they are awkward walkers. The Pongidae generally walk on their knuckles. In other words, they use their legs to support themselves, and they use their knuckles for balance. So you can see here this Pongid is using its knuckles. And the great apes, the humans, the third great group, the Hominidae, are upright walkers. They are the only species that habitually walks upright. which is a good reason to pay attention to your posture, because if you allow your upright walking to be degraded, you're going to look more like this. And you may have seen those illustrations where a man starts out crawling, and then he becomes able to walk, and he walks upright, and then when he gets old again, he uses a cane to walk about and looks more like the great ape. So anyway, the hylobatidae are brachiators, which means their locomotion is by swinging arm movements with their body suspended from their arms. And one could hardly mistake this for a human. It has a superficial resemblance of the apes, the great apes, but it has very long arms, and its habitual behavior is to stay up in the trees. The Pongidae, the knuckle walkers, are quadrupedal when on the ground. They do go into trees occasionally, but when they're on the ground, they are quadrupedal, and their knuckles make contact with the ground. So that means not their fingers, not like this, but like this, which is interesting because some of you are aware there was a group of people in Turkey a few years back who it was asserted had regressed to their ancestral form of walking because they walked around on all fours all the time. And after being studied by all the sophisticated methods of modern psychology, and the conclusions drawn that this was a throwback to the ancestors, then it was found out that it was all just fake. And they were just doing this because they gained their family publicity, which is amusing, but also challenges some of the things that psychologists tell us. And here's the hominidae, and of course he chose a picture of me with all four on the ground, or at least walking on my knuckles. But that's not normal for me. I normally walk upright. Today, there are no modern morphological intermediates between the families. Something is either a gibbon, or a brachiator, or a pongid, or a human. And they can easily be distinguished by the means of locomotion. Now, some of the great apes can stand upright. And they do occasionally, and especially the bonobos, which is a group of chimpanzees, they do occasionally even walk upright, but it's not normal. And it's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about the exceptions, we're talking about what's normal. So finding out who walks upright and who doesn't is one of the major issues that's being confronted in talking about the origin of man. How do you know that some fossils a human ancestor, if you believe that they had ancestors that were not humans? It would be a human ancestor if it walked upright. So at some point, an ape ancestor started walking upright, and that became the human race. That's the theory that evolution gives us. There are, however, bipedal fossils that are intermediate between the pongids and the anatomically modern man. And these are the ones that are going to cause us to rethink some of our ideas. There are 6 main groups of these. Australopithecines, shown here in the middle, not very tall, and didn't have much of a forehead, but they apparently walked upright from their pelvis. Early Homo, the Homo erectus, here you can see a Homo erectus, archaic Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and anatomically modern man. So here's an anatomically modern man. The thing we share is we all walked upright. The question is, are we related genetically, and if so, how? First, let's take a look at the similarities between these groups. We can tell whether a fossil walked upright or not by the morphology of the pelvis and femur. So you look at the head of the pelvis, the socket, the occipital condyle, which was so important for us in the dinosaurs. The occipital condyle is also important for defining upright walking. So the height and shape of the iliac crest, this is the iliac crest right here. The height and shape of the iliac crest relates to the visceral support. It is off of this bone, this extension of the bone, that the mass of the viscera, that's your stomach, is supported. So in the great apes, there has to be muscles, have to be muscles that are anchored to the iliac crest, which surround the gut mass to keep it in place. And in humans, we don't have that because in humans there is a visceral basket here that holds the gut. So instead of having to rely on our stomach to hold in our gut, some of us don't do too good a job of that, humans are built with a basket-shaped pelvis that accommodates the gut and holds the mass of the weight. So you can see the difference here. Here's a great ape, here's a human, a much shorter iliac crest. The angle at which the insertion of the femur is active is much greater in humans than it is in great apes. Notice there's only a small amount of forward motion possible in the great ape. In the human, there's this much. So compare that with this. On the left-hand side is the chimpanzee. Here you can see this gigantic iliac crest, which supports the mass of the viscera when he's bent over double. In between is the Australopithecine pelvis. Notice that it's not as tall as the chimpanzee pelvis, so it's more conformable to the upright body and would be able to support the mass of the viscera better. Over here is Homo erectus, and you can see it's even more like the modern human pelvis over here. So this is modern human. Notice it forms a nice basket there to support the gut. This is kind of intermediate. Then here is the chimpanzee over here. So one could make the argument that the Australopithecine, erectine, chimpanzee, Australopithecine, erectine, modern human is a series of developmental stages in the pelvis. But in any case, it's clear that these are able to walk upright. These, and these walk upright. This one did not. All right, let's take a look at the skulls from three different views. This is a side view. This is a chimpanzee. Notice the prognathic muzzle. So the muzzle extends several inches in front of the face. You would be remiss not to visit your orthodontist if you had that problem. Okay, here is Australopithecine. Notice the muzzle extension in the front. Homo erectus, modern Homo habilis. Over here are the Neanderthals. And notice in Neanderthal, there's pronounced prognathism. And in modern human, the face is straight down. The other thing you see in this view is the occipital bun. That's this part of the skull that extends to the rear. Occipital bun, 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 occipital bun. Oh, none there. So two characteristics that you can see in the side view are present in chimpanzees and all intermediate forms, but not present in modern man. The third thing you can see in this view is this groove, the sulcus that goes behind the eye socket, which is present there in the chimpanzee. You can't always see it because some of these skulls are not complete, but it's there, 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 but not there. And the fourth thing you can see is a very robust orbit. See how powerful and strong that orbit is? Powerful and strong and gracile. Not strong at all. So there's four characteristics that separate chimpanzees and all fossil hominids, including Neanderthal, from modern man. You can see some of those same characteristics in the top view. You can see the prognathism. You can see the sulcus right there in the front of the skull. Sulcus, 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 no sulcus. And here at the bottom, you can see that the widest part of the skull of the chimpanzee is at the base. The widest skull of the Australopithecus is at the base. The widest skull of all the other, widest part of all the other skulls is at the base of the skull until you get to modern man. In modern man, the widest part is up here in the parietals. Okay, here's the front of the skull. This is a chimpanzee. This is a chimpanzee here. This is Australopithecus. This is Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Neanderthal, and modern human. The hominid face is more chimp-like in all hominids other than anatomically modern man. So here you can see the robust eyes. You can see the prognathism. You can see the widest part of the skulls at the base. All these characteristics are chimp-like, but not present in modern man. Here's the parietal bulge at the base of the skull in chimpanzee. Widest part of the skull in every hominid species except anatomically modern man's at the base of the skull. In modern humans, there's a parietal bulge. Here you can see the occipital bun on that skull and on Neanderthal, but not on modern man. Here's the extension of the muzzle, and the straight face. Here's the sulcus behind the eye, straight down. Skulls in all hominid species except anatomically modern man have a sulcus and an acute angle in the occipital bone. Looking at the bottom of the skull, here's chimpanzee, here's Australopithecus, Homo erectus, and modern man. Notice that there is a gradation. There is a movement from the back of the skull so that the animal can look up like this and look straight ahead. Here is Australopithecus, it's a little farther forward. In Homo erectus, it's nearly as far forward as modern man, but it's still ovoid. And then here is modern man. So the foramen magnum is showing a gradational response in these various forms. So this one you would suspect held its head more upright more of the time than this one or this one. When you look at the palate, this is a chimpanzee palate. Notice the tooth rows are straight. This is a modern human palate. Notice there's a perfect parabolic arch. And down here you can see chimpanzee. This is chimpanzee. This is Homo Australopithecus, Homo erectus. Here's Homo habilis here, and here's Homo neanderthalensis. Even Neanderthal shows a straight set of molars. They don't show this parabolic arch. Okay, so here we have a chimpanzee. These are all things you can test yourself. So I want you to take your tongue and put it against your bottom teeth and run it down the back of your bottom teeth. Does it hit a shelf there? Don't say it out loud. If you have a shelf there, then you have a simian shelf, and that's a characteristic of apes. Okay, so don't tell me about it now, you can tell me later. But that's a characteristic of apes, to have a simian shelf. Okay, the other thing that they have, as I said, they have an arch to their teeth in humans and not in the other ones. The second characteristic that you should check is the presence of a chin. Take your fingers and reach down here and feel the bottom of your jaw and see if there's a chin there. If there's a chin, that is a characteristic present in modern humans, not present in any of the other forms, including Neanderthal. So Neanderthals do not have a chin. Chimpanzees do not have a chin. Neanderthals have a simian shelf. It's usually reduced and may be difficult to discern, but is present in some, in others not so obvious. But it's present, and there is no chin. Okay, so what am I saying? Why am I presenting this data which seems to challenge the idea that humans were created? Well, so far I've challenged all my classes to test these things. Nobody's come up afterwards and said, I have a simian shelf, or I don't have a mental eminence, my chin just goes straight underneath, or I have brow ridges up here on my skull, or I have a prognathic muzzle. Nobody's ever said that. It's not present in any humans. You would expect that if we have been derived from the great apes, that there would be throwbacks once in a while, and we would see some of these characteristics in the population. So the absence of any of these characteristics in anything other than modern humans makes us wonder just exactly what's going on. So how can you explain the fact that there is a gradation in characteristics between modern humans and chimpanzees, including the Neanderthals, and including Homo erectines and Homo habilis, and including the Australopithecines? How do you explain that? Neanderthals, recall, Neanderthals bury their dead with ceremonies, including flowers and jewelry or stone things in their graves. I would say not jewelry, but various things in their grave. But they do put flowers in the graves. So it looks like Neanderthals, which is a race in Europe that is very human-like, it looks like Neanderthals have some characteristics of human behavior. Do we bury our dead? Yeah. Neanderthals buried their dead. So what do we make of this? How can we fit this all together? Well, most people, most Christians who believe that God created man a few thousand years ago, most Christians that believe the Bible story of creation try to do this. They say, all right, I'm going to draw a line here. Let's just go back a couple of slides here. I'm going to draw a line right here, let's say after Homo erectines, and we'll put Australopithecines and apes on this side of the line, and we'll put modern humans on this side of the line. And these are just modern humans. That's what some Christians do in order to be able to deal with these data. But the line is completely arbitrary. As I've showed you, all of these organisms from here to here have ape characteristics mixed in with increasing amounts of human characteristics. So how are we going to deal with these data? Could we suggest the possibility that there may have been interbreeding between humans and animals, either experimental in the laboratory, like we're doing today, or in nature? It's conceivable. It's not something I want to think about, but it is a possibility we need to consider. It doesn't really matter how it happened. If it's been done and these have been produced, then what do? Are they humans? Are they apes? So if these kinds of organisms were produced and they were fertile, then they could cross back this way or this way and generate the other ones in between. And it's possible that what we're looking at here is the aberrancy of human behavior, before the flood or after the flood or both. Because these fossils, according to most people's thinking, these fossils are all after the flood. So is that a possibility you would be willing to consider? Well, yes, if somebody could show me that this cross could be done. Well, I have documentation that this cross has been tried at University of Pennsylvania back in the late 1990s. There was a laboratory there that was doing this kind of stuff. And they claimed that, and this was when I was listening in on a professional anthropology listserv, and I have all the emails with me if you want to look at them. They claimed that they had crossed a human and a chimpanzee, and that the embryo was aborted after the first trimester because if it was born, what would they do with it? And they would have been the pariah of the scientific community because they had done this horrible, immoral experiment. And not only that, but what are they going to do with this organism that results? So they aborted the fetus after the first trimester. They talked about it on this among these professional listserv anthropologists, physical anthropologists, and nobody challenged that they had done it because everybody knew about it. But after a little while, one guy wrote back and he said, "We better not let the creationists hear about this." Why? Why would he not want creationists to hear about it?
Because it would fill in the gaps.
Yeah, because this is a logical explanation for the data. And they recognize that, and so they said, we better not let the creationists hear about it. But it was too late. I was eavesdropping on them. So is it possible? It seems to be. Humans have 23 chromosomes, chimpanzees have 24, but of those 24, 2 of them appear to be the same as one of the 23 in humans. So it's possible that they could line up and have a viable disjunction. Yes?
I thought there were species-specific mechanisms that prevented the breeding of different species.
Well,
How do you bypass?
that's something that generally persists in nature. But if you take two chimpanzees, two chipmunks of different species, put them in a cage together, a male and a female, and there's nobody else around, well, guess what? They'll have offspring. In nature, it would never happen because there are mechanisms to prevent this from happening. In nature, this would not happen because there are mechanisms to prevent that from happening. Mainly our moral sense of what's right and wrong. But when those forces are disrupted or removed, it doesn't appear that there's any natural barrier to these kinds of things. Now, oftentimes, well, think of a horse and a donkey that makes a mule. The mule is sterile. It can't have offspring. But that doesn't mean that other species that cross are always sterile. So that's what we find when we look at the data. And it looks like it's a better match of the data than just saying arbitrarily, there's a line right here, and these are human, and these are animals, different species of apes, and these are humans. So it's controversial, of course. It's not something that I want to present in a public arena, but it also gives us an answer for one of the most perplexing challenges to our understanding of what the fossil record is about. Now, lately, just in the last few months and even weeks and even days, even since I've been out here in Wyoming, they have come up with some human fossils, modern man, that are way down in here somewhere. That doesn't change the perspective on this or the perspective on the kinds of crossing that I think has happened. It doesn't change that at all. You still have to explain where these forms came from. But finding human fossils that are down in this range somewhere makes it seem that maybe this explanation of being hundreds of thousands of years is not right, or it's not the only or best explanation. Any other questions? Yes.
What is evolutionist explanation for why there's still chimpanzees around the place?
They would say that you had a common ancestor between man and chimpanzee. So here's modern man, here's modern chimpanzee. You go backwards, you would see intermediates here and intermediates here, and eventually they would merge with some common ancestor. So that's not an objection. That's a irrational objection to their theory, because it says it means the person. And I've heard this many times. It's not you. I've heard this many times. In fact, one of the popular circuit speakers, that's one of his main arguments, is why do we still have monkeys? Why aren't the monkeys becoming humans now, if that's how it happened originally? Well, that's not what evolution says. Evolution says that a series of steps took place from a common ancestor between chimpanzees and humans. Somewhere back there they share a common ancestor, but that common ancestor has died off and been replaced by these other forms. So it's not really a valid objection to the theory to say, why are there still chimpanzees here? Because they would say, well, we aren't saying it was a chimpanzee. We're saying the chimpanzee is a modern representative of the other branch.
Wouldn't that mean, though, that the new chimpanzees kind of go backwards?
No, if you think about what I just said, that there is a common ancestor that we don't know, and that's interesting because we never know the common ancestor of anything. You know, if you look at these trees in your textbooks that purport to show relationships between organisms, wherever they branch, there's nothing there. But the things up here at the end, you can always postulate that there was some common ancestor. So they're postulating a common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans, and that chimpanzees, and then the ancestry developed in one direction over here that ended up with chimpanzees, and the other direction over here that ended up with humans. Does that make sense? Yes.
What do you mean exactly about common ancestor? I mean, it means that all of the characteristics somewhere between two form, or what is it exactly?
A common ancestor is defined as one that shares a suite of characteristics that define that clade, that group. So it would be things that the human has, that the chimpanzee has, would have been present in the common ancestor. Now, there are lots of other things that evolutionists would say have developed since then. And of course, it's on them to explain how they developed. For example, the gene that makes us have big brains. Our brains are bigger than chimpanzee brains. I don't think I would like to trade my brain in for a chimpanzee brain, even though we've already discussed, a raven, a little tiny bird brain, can do marvelous things. I don't want a chimpanzee brain, I want a human brain, because the human brain is the apex of development of the nervous system. And so I think probably you would have to say that that gene that makes the human brain big developed not from anything in the chimpanzee, but from accidental changes in a protein that wasn't doing anything before, or was doing something unnecessary before. And now it's changed so it produces a bigger brain. And those genes like that are called orphan genes. Orphan genes are genes that are present in the human and not present in the chimpanzee at all. So there is no common thread that delineates a lot of the genes in any organism that are called orphan genes. And one of them is the gene that makes our brains big. There's a suite of genes in the honeybee, for example, that are orphan genes that make honey. They aren't present in any of the other bees. And those genes are only present in the honeybee. How did they get there? Well, they had to, if you're an evolutionist, they had to evolve independently as the honeybee split off from some common ancestor. But if an evolutionist can't tell me a single case of how a protein can develop from a non-coding protein into a coding functional protein, a single case can explain to me how it developed. Not making it up with arm waving, but giving me the actual changes that took place. How can I believe them when they say, oh, these 9 genes that are orphan genes in the honeybee, they just developed over time? Or that gene that makes our brain big, that's present in humans but not present in any of the ancestors, supposed ancestors, that gene developed from nothing. And now it makes our brains big. Well, explain to me how a gene becomes a gene that makes our brains big when it was nothing before. Give me the steps. Give me how it changed step by step by step from a non-functional, non-existent gene. So orphan genes are one of the strongest arguments in favor of the hypothesis of creation, because we can't tell you why there are so many orphan genes. Hundreds and hundreds of genes in humans. Hundreds and hundreds of genes in every taxon are orphans. They do not come from any ancestor that we can find. And of course nowadays that's all people do when they find a new gene. They do a shotgun on the whole, all the other organisms to try to find where it is. And these orphan genes don't come up with anything. So that's why they're called orphans. It also stands for ORF, is an open reading frame. That's how they identify a gene from a non-gene, is an open reading frame. That means that it has a length that can be defined, where it can be read and copied and make a protein. Yes.
When did the scientists make the cross? When was that?
That was done in the late 1990s. We actually found a website at University of Pennsylvania, and it disappeared almost immediately after that. And then this discourse went on the paleoanthropology listserv shortly thereafter. But we actually saw the website at University of Pennsylvania. That was back before they did these elaborate hoax websites. That was in the early days of websites. Yes.
In that experiment, did they actually have a hypothesis of what it would look like?
They have it somewhere. I'm sure they didn't throw it away. But I don't know anything more about it than that, and I'm sure you couldn't find anything out by asking. But I can show you the conversation that went on if you want. Any other questions? Yes?
There, among the schools, there are are given there, I mean, not all skulls are gonna look alike. There are gonna be variations just among the species itself.
There are variations among skulls. Like human skulls, you can find a range of different sizes and shapes. In fact, Neanderthals, the ones next to them right here, these are Neanderthals, their skulls are often larger than modern humans. The cranial capacity in Neanderthal skull is a little larger than the average for modern humans. So you can have small skulls, you can have big skulls, you can have some variations in what kind of features are on the skull, but you won't find a modern human who has doesn't have a chin. And you won't find a modern human who has a sulcus with the eyes projecting beyond it, and you won't find a modern human who has a muzzle in the front, and you won't find a modern human with an occipital bone unless their skulls were bound when they were young. Now, if they bind the skulls are plastic enough so that they can be made to bulge out in the back. And oftentimes in China, they used to bind their baby to a board. And so the baby would get a very flat skull on the back. So that you can find human skulls that are flat because of this binding that was done. But those are understandable things that you can account for, you can accommodate. There also are people that have their skulls bound up when they're babies and push them out the top, so they have big tall heads in some cultures. And those are all understandable things. You can account for those. But when you find a skull out in nature and it's not from one of these cultures, it's going to look like a human skull. I've found lots of them on beaches in the Hawaiian Islands and down in Peru, where the grave diggers come along and they dig up all these graves and just throw them out. Or in the Catholic Church in Lima, if you ever get there, where the Inquisition was held. And if you go down into the catacombs below the church, you can find the register which tells what every person had done and why they were killed. And then it tells, and then you go on back and you see these huge cisterns, maybe 10, 15 feet across, completely filled with perfectly placed human skulls. Thousands of them. And there'll be femurs in another one, and so on. It's really bizarre. But there you have a chance to look at thousands of skulls. And when people do that, they all look like modern humans. Any other questions or comments? Now, the amalgamation hypothesis has been hotly contested in some circles because people try to say, well, that's these guys over here. They're the ones that resulted from amalgamation. Remember this. Number one, all humans of all races and all ethnic clines have all these human characteristics. Number one. Number two, the Neanderthals, the ones you might think were the crosses, they live in Europe, not in Africa. Some of these forms are in Africa, some are in China, some are in various places around the world, but trying to assert that this is somebody else's race is self-serving and foolish, and it's insecure. It's a form of insecurity. That's why people look down on other races, because they feel a little insecure about these guys. And so anyway, it has nothing to do with racism. It's just something that has to do with these things, none of which are alive today. We don't have any Neanderthals. We don't have any Australopithecines. We don't have any Homo erectings, Homo habilis, or any of the new ones that they're finding now. There is one more thing you should be aware. There's a little island down in the Pacific, and I think it's the name of this Flores Islands, at least the species they found there was called Homo florensis. It's part of the area, I think, around Palau or somewhere out there. Well, actually, it's close to Australia. And on this island, they found a human skull. It was a human-like skull of somebody who's about 3 feet tall, an adult, about that tall. And it had all of these characteristics that we talked about. So it looked like a throwback to, say, Homo erectus or something like that. It had the brow ridges, it had the, I do not believe it had a chin, and I think I don't know if it had a simian shelf, but this threw a monkey wrench in all the plans of evolution because it was dated as 15,000 years old by radiocarbon. So this is way too recent to still have these guys surviving unless there are other things that can generate these kinds of features. And so Homo florensis, I'm not sure what the current status is on that. Does anybody know? But it's worth looking into because it's really interesting to see how people can skate on some of these issues.
Argument with that Homo florensis was on an island where there's not enough food resource, so their size is smaller than that of a Homo hominid. That explains why they're only 3 feet tall.
It's called The Hobbit, by the way. I don't know why, because I haven't seen those movies, but yeah, the idea is that on islands things get small. Okay, so why does it have all the other characteristics of Homo erectus? That's not something that bad nutrition can give you as far as we know. And there doesn't seem to be any disease that gives you hominid characteristics. You don't have this suite of characteristics from any disease that we're aware of. So just understand that this is an area where true answers are hard to come by even among professionals. And I don't claim to be a professional, but I know someone who had a suggestion that the possibility was that these organisms had interbred, and there seems to be substantial evidence for that possibility. And of course we're doing this all the time now. We're taking human genes and putting them into all kinds of things. Spinach, pigs, you name it. There are people putting human genes into all kinds of things. They're also trying to produce organs that can be used to replace your heart. Like, hello, do you not want to die someday? Do you want to live forever? And I do, but I want to live forever in his plan, not in mine. And so you have this idea that we can make organs for replacing our organs by crossing them into a chimpanzee. And this can't be done in the United States currently, although they just passed some legislation that would allow these kind of crosses. But it can be done offshore. And I'm not sure that it's not being done. Yes?
I read an article recently that they said they were attaching living heart tissue, not heart tissue, heart cells, like tissue cells, into a spinach leaf, and it actually started growing.
Yeah. Yeah, they're doing all kinds of weird things. Which reminds me of a statement that a woman I respect very much made, talking about this very issue of crossing humans and other organisms. She said, if there was one sin above another that brought the destruction of the world in the flood, and this is after she has elaborated rape, murder, incest, all these other sins. She says if there was one sin above another that brought the destruction of the world in the flood. It was the base crime of the amalgamation of man and beast, which, because you are taking the image of God and putting it into another creature, you are perverting the image of God. And is that organism, can it be saved? Is it something Jesus died for? There are all kinds of questions that can arise as a result of thinking about that. But it indicates the fact that we're on very thin ice right now because we're doing these same kinds of things, taking genes from humans and putting them into all over the place. And it's easy to do. So we'll see what happens. But it's an indication that we may not be long for this world. I guess that's a good thing. Thank you.